For our group's final presentation, we chose the topic on Jeffrey Dahmer and how he affected the United States today. The presentation is by Madison, Mara, Emma, Rebecca, and Leah. Throughout this presentation, we will discuss the introduction, the background on serial killers in general, the background on Jeffrey Dahmer himself, how his parents were affected, some crimes he committed, how his crimes affected others, his arrests and trials, and finally how his arrest and trial affected the United States. We also included a short video clip. For the introduction, this presentation argues that Jeffrey Dahmer had a major impact on the public's perception of a serial killer. Today he is known as one of the world's most famous killers, and unfortunately his ways of committing crimes have made others act just like him. This made it more common to have crimes committed in the United States. This topic touches on a different time in America, punishment, crime, and background of people living in America at the time. The effects of what Jeffrey Dahmer did during his time of crime has significantly impacted the world from that point forward. Serial killers' background. Although many serial killers have been around, Jeffrey Dahmer has had the biggest impact on America today. In the 1980s, serial killers sparked a panic among American society, and serial killers were the headline news more than ever before. The beginning of the serial killer panic of the 1980s, law enforcement in general and the FBI were presented as being in control of the problem. Movies, books, magazines, media, newspapers, and more have given serial killers an unparalleled degree of visibility and fame in the contemporary American public society. As shown below, there are images of serial killer headlines and images of serial killers' mugshots and movies that are based on serial killers.
Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer who took the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. Over the course of more than 13 years, Dahmer had only sought out men, mostly African American men, which he would find at gay bars, malls, and bus stops, where he would then lure them home with promises of money or sex while giving them alcohol laced with drugs before strangling them to death. After his victims were dead, he would engage in sexual activities with the corpses, and before disposing of them, he would keep a body part as a souvenir before dismembering the bodies. Dahmer was captured in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms. He was killed by a fellow prison inmate, Christopher Scarver, in 1994 and never completed his terms. Dahmer claims that his compulsions towards necrophilia and murder began around the age of 14, but it appears that the breakdown of his parents' marriage and their divorce a few years later may have been what prompted his murderous spree. He eventually became an alcoholic and dropped out of school at Ohio State University only after one semester and was becoming too much for his parents to bear. After being convicted of his murders, his father felt some type of responsibility as to why Jeffrey became a serial killer. Lionel said he was negligent and probably didn't give enough to Jeffrey emotionally. He also felt the medications Joyce was on while pregnant could have negatively impacted his brain development. A quote from Joyce, Jeffrey's mother: "I wake up every morning and for a split second I don't know I'm Jeffrey Dahmer's mother, and then it all floods in." Joyce Flint said this during a 1993 interview. Joyce took it worse than Lionel. She did try to commit suicide. She turned on her gas oven and left its door open. Next to her lay a suicide note which read, "It's been a lonely life, especially today. Please cremate me. I love my sons Jeffrey and David."
This slide is going to focus on some of the crimes that Jeffrey Dahmer has committed. There is many murders and other things that he has done in his lifetime before he was arrested in 1991. I'm just going to cover a few of the different things that he did. If you want to see the entire timeline, if you click the first link in our resource slide, it'll take you to the website. Jeffrey Dahmer identified as a gay man, so all of his victims were men. He claims that he had a fantasy about picking up a hitchhiker and being dominant and taking control of him, so that is what he did for his first ever murder. His first ever victim was Stephen Hicks. He was an 18-year-old man who was a hitchhiker. He brought him to his parents' house in Ohio. He had sex with him, strangled him, dismembered the body, placing it in trash bags. He was then arrested in 1982 and charged with disorderly conduct in 1986, got out of jail and continued killing throughout 1987 until he was arrested again in 1988 for sexual assault because he was lurking after minors. When he got out of jail, he began killing again in 1989, and this is when he began to keep what he liked to call his trophies. He would pick up men in gay bars, and after he would do what he wanted, he would murder them, dismember them, and keep certain parts of their body, such as heads, faces, genitals, feet, etc., in his freezer and other substances to keep as his own trophies. In 1991, he attempted to put a victim in a zombie-like state by drugging him, and when he awoken, he was able to get to the police. They ended up going into his apartment, finding numerous body parts and many Polaroid pictures of the crimes that he has committed, and he ended up being arrested, and that is when his killing spree ended in 1991. The picture on this slide is of some of the people that were his victims. How Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes affected others. If you were to do a Google search right now of the most popular or famous serial killers in the world, Jeffrey Dahmer's name will always be towards the top of the list. He has helped create the public perception of what a serial killer is today. After he was arrested, many news reporters flocked to Milwaukee to get the scoop on Jeffrey Dahmer and get multiple news coverage articles. Many people were afraid to leave their houses, thinking that more of them might be out there, but especially gay men and men of the Black and Hispanic races, because that's who most of Jeffrey's victims were. Jeffrey claimed that those were his victims because he was attracted to them. Parents and families of the victims were never the same after finding out that their child, loved one, friend, etc. was murdered and dismembered. One of the biggest effects that he had on people was the people of the gay community, since many of his victims were picked up in gay bars and gay clubs. One person once said that it was very depressing because the number of people in the clubs was getting smaller and the amount of funerals they were attending was getting larger, and it really affected their mental health. It also was very scary of the fact that people who were insane mentally wanted to be like Jeffrey and got ideas from what they heard that he has done and wanted to do it themselves.
About Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest and trial. Jeffrey Dahmer was in and out of jail multiple times over the years, those reasons being for him being drunk and disorderly conduct, indecently exposing himself, sexual assault, and then for his murders. When Dahmer was caught, the police had found 11 victims, their dismembered bodies, and pictures of many victims from over the years' dismembered bodies in his home. After the arrest was made,
Dahmer was asked by an agent if he would ever be able to live a normal life if he was free and not in prison. But Dahmer said that prison was the best place for him because if he was out and free in the world, he would continue his behavior and continue his killings. Dahmer was sentenced to 16 life terms in prison, but he was shortly later killed by an inmate. Many things were then done to diagnose his behavior after his arrest. How his arrest and trial affected the United States. Jeffrey Dahmer's case clearly affected Americans in many different ways, one being a relief that the killer was caught and that there would no longer be any killings, and another being the families who were hurt in the process due to the loss and murder of a loved one. The FBI stepped up their involvement in cases similar and started to use the insights of psychology and behavioral science to violent crime behavior. They wanted to use this tactic to try to diagnose people and to try to stop the killings. They also decided to move forward with using DNA analysis and automated fingerprint capabilities to stop killers and to identify their victims.
Summary and conclusion. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most well-known serial killers in the United States. Leaving the biggest impact on American citizens, Jeffrey Dahmer left people worried to leave their homes and became a blueprint for people who wanted to do what Dahmer did. In conclusion, Dahmer had a major impact on the public's perception of what a serial killer is due to his 17 gruesome murders. Sources: Biography.com, Jeffrey Dahmer, A Timeline of His Murders, Arrests, and Death, Corrections1.com, Dahmer's Last Interview, FBI.gov, Grunge.com, This Is What Jeffrey Dahmer's Parents Really Thought of Him, The Encyclopedia of Serial Killers, Jeffrey Dahmer, A Terrifying True Story of Rape, Murder, and Cannibalism.